I've been living to see you, dying to see you, but it shouldn't be like this. This was unexpected. What do I do now? Could we start again, please? I was reminded of these words from the musical Jesus Christ Superstar when I was preparing for this reflection. Despite the fundamentalist protests that often occur outside showings of this musical, personally I've always found these words very powerful, profound, and piercing, especially in Holy Week, even though as a Christian I don't literally believe that they are true. The lyrics are insightful, not because they have some doctrinal window, but instead because they reflect what the disciples at the time must have been feeling and thinking. And it's what I think I find myself falling into in this season of Holy Week. Because I think we can be tempted to think that Jesus went wrong in Holy Week and was carried away by events. So in the light of this, as we wait in this now and not yet of Holy Week, when we know already what is to come, but have not yet got there, I'd like us to reflect tonight together upon the theme of Jesus being sacrificed from eternity. I think it's a theme that comes through in both of our readings this evening, both in Psalm 88, where we hear of Jesus being at the point of death from his youth, but also in Jesus' foretelling of his own death and resurrection in Matthew 16. It's not just found in these passages, though, because we find it across the Old and the New Testaments as well. We read in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 8, that Jesus is the Lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world. Similarly, we read in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, that Jesus was crucified according to the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. And when we look at the Old Testament, we also see specific prophecies of Jesus' death in chapters such as Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, in Psalm 22, and also in Zechariah 12. Perhaps more poignantly for us in this week of Holy Week is the fact that Jesus himself repeatedly prophesied his own death during his ministry here on earth. In fact, he prophesied his own death on 3 separate occasions, which we can find each of them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As you know, we had one of those prophecies read this evening from Matthew 16, verses 21 to 23. Just to remind you, Matthew writes, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. So in the mind of the scriptures, but also in the mind of Jesus himself, the crucifixion was not just an afterthought to the fall of humanity. It wasn't simply a plan B or a backup option or an accident. The events of Holy Week did not suddenly arrive all out of the blue as if they were precipitated suddenly by unexpected events. No, as Christians, we believe that God planned it all. But more importantly, perhaps, that he planned it all for his glory. So what do we do with that dramatic and radical knowledge that Jesus' crucifixion was both foreknown by God, but also pre-planned in his mind? How should we respond to that? Well, I don't know about you, but I was often told at Sunday school to ask myself in these deep situations, what would Jesus do? And I'd like to suggest, in response to that Jesus' response is that he does not cower or hide from this foreboding heavy knowledge of his own death and the brutal manner of it, but instead that he embraces it as part of his vocation and calling. The weight of this knowledge does not give him angst or drag him down, but it instead lifts him up to the cross where he knows that he should be. Just as God has loved us with an everlasting love, so he has pre-planned how we shall be redeemed from all eternity, from before the foundation of the world. The crucifixion, therefore, is not forced upon Jesus by the Father, but it is instead both planned by God, but also freely chosen by Jesus. As we see from the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus chose the cross despite the deep bitterness of this medication for human sin. So as Christians, while we believe that God the Son, Jesus, is a distinct person from his Father, they are not two separate persons, but are instead distinct within the Godhead. So there's therefore a degree in which God the Father is not inflicting suffering upon his unwilling and distant Son, but is instead choosing to inflict suffering on himself for our sake. Now, all this might sound rather abstract, complicated, and mysterious, but I think that's precisely the point. We read in the first letter to the Corinthians that the cross is foolishness to the Gentiles, that it does not make sense to them that as Christians we follow a crucified king. They cannot understand, and the world today cannot understand, why the image of a helpless, suffering Christ is actually the icon of our faith. They cannot see that in faith we can know that being disguised under the disfigurement of an ugly crucifixion, Christ upon the cross is paradoxically the greatest revelation of who God is, as Hans von Balthasar wrote. We see this also from our psalm, where the psalmist declares in Psalm 88, verse 4, "I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength." I think the cross shows us that love is the opposite of power, and therefore that in waging war against the everlasting love of Christ, sin counterproductively defeats itself, because it is only ever parasitic and destructive. The love of God, however, magnanimously, humbly, and quietly defeats sin in this mysterious exchange on the cross. However, we have together made a world where power and control rule, and so often we find ourselves refusing to believe that love is the opposite of power. We fall into the temptation that things are good and things are going well and things are as they should be when we are in control and when we can make decisions for ourselves. We make an idol out of autonomy. But we forget that Christ himself was following a path that was not one that he would have wanted in some ways. The crucifixion is the ultimate victory for us because it is that paradox. It's that letting go of control for the sake of a greater good. So in these times of temptation, I find myself saying, with the words of Jesus Christ Superstar, I think you've made your point now at this stage of Holy Week. You've even gone a bit too far to get the message home. Before it gets too frightening, we ought to call a halt. Peter says a similar thing immediately after Jesus foretells his death. We read, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you. Rebuking God, I hear myself say, that seems so distant and remote. I would never do that. However, I forget how often I effectively do that and besmirch Christ's sacrifice. How often I downplay the depth of my sin and thereby imply that Christ's costly sacrifice was unnecessary and excessive, something for other people, for evil people that we hear about in the news. I forget how often, like the crowd, I mock the plan of God and suggest that it wasn't necessary. I say, if you're the Son of God, save yourself. And I wonder, together, as we reflect, how often we, like Peter, sometimes lack the determination to go through with the plan of God, even when it seems to be mysterious and scary and frightening to us. And how often we lack the will to endure the sacrifice that it entails and to take it to the very end. How often do we together say to God, could we start again, please? How often do we say, before it gets too frightening, we ought to call a halt? Or how often do we say with Peter, far be it from us, Lord, that this should happen? How much more often should we say instead, here I am, Lord, send me? Amen.